Hey, this is David Plotz, CEO of CityCast. I have a favor to ask before we get to today's conversation. We're doing our annual listener survey, and it would really help us out if you took it. And even if you took it last year, we'd be grateful if you took it again, because we can't use last year's data. Please go to citycast.fm/survey to take the survey. It's only 7 minutes long, we know, because we timed it. That's citycast.fm/survey. And when you take the survey, you'll also be eligible to win a $250 Visa gift card and CityCast swag, that great CityCast swag. citycast.fm/survey.
Today on CityCast Boise. Our state's marijuana laws are some of the strictest in the nation, and it's costing us, not just in lost tax revenue. We're exploring the political and cultural roadblocks that are maintaining Idaho's weed prohibition, despite public support for decriminalization. Could a ballot initiative be the solution? It's Wednesday, January 29th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me today is Joe Evans with Kind Idaho. Thanks for being here today, Joe.
Thank you for having me today, Lindsay.
So Idaho is one of only 4 states in the entire country that hasn't legalized or decriminalized marijuana in some way. Compared to the rest of the country, kind of feels like we've got a bit of a modern day prohibition going on here. So what makes us such an outlier on this issue compared to the rest of the country?
A lot of it could be related to our religious background here in the state. We have strong Catholic, strong LDS involvement in our politics here in the state. One of the other things that we have is a big influx of individuals who have come from states where marijuana was legalized badly. You've seen places where they introduced it without proper consideration, without proper certification of the doctors in question. California likes to complain about, as soon as they legalized medical, doctors were just writing prescriptions left and right. So they're coming from those places and they're going, we're not going to let that happen in our state. And you see that from the political perspective with the number of political refugees from other states who've come in and gotten involved in state politics after having been here less than 2 or 3 years. And a lot of that is the big push why we're not seeing it legalized, either medicinally or even decriminalized. Why it hasn't happened yet.
And I definitely want to hone in on that because this issue came back into the spotlight with the legislature introducing House Bill 7 just recently. And so I want to know from your perspective, what is House Bill 7 and what would a mandatory minimum fine for marijuana possession mean in practical terms for Idahoans?
So House Bill 7, it's a mandatory minimum of $300. And the interesting perspective of this is it is the only misdemeanor charge that currently holds mandatory minimum and will hold an additional financial mandatory minimum.
So why do you think the Idaho legislature, out of all of these other misdemeanors that don't carry a mandatory minimum, why are they honing in on marijuana possession and possession of less than 3 ounces, which would be a misdemeanor?
Right. And there's arguments for a lot of this. They talk about the moral equivalency. Barb Earhart and Heather Scott both talked heavily about the ability or the interference on the judge's ability to moderate based on the offense, based on the crime, based on the quantity, extenuating circumstances. But ultimately what it comes down to is I think a significant number of our legislators feel that marijuana is a greater threat to the republic in the state of Idaho than feeding your children, which I find a little bit misplaced. But again, this comes back from a certain amount of trauma associated with coming from other states where it was introduced badly. You listen to the Republicans, the conservatives from out of state who come in, who talk about what it's like on the streets of LA or the streets of San Francisco or Portland or Seattle, how everybody's just lighting up everywhere and you're seeing people, on the streets. Now, I tend to say, well, why are we blaming drugs for something that is a financial crisis, post-COVID economic loss. These are people who've gone through job losses, home losses, housing crisis. They're on the street for a number of reasons. And one of the things that was actually interesting, this was brought up by the police during the discussions during the committee hearing, was the majority get involved or are arrested, processed for possession of marijuana happen to be street people. It's stops in public. It's walk by, empty your pocket, show me what you got. And these are people who live on the streets. They don't have a home to hide their use in. They're always where they can be seen. So this, in terms of who it affects, it actually comes down to more of a class warfare issue than it actually is a morality issue. So they don't have the ability to pay the fines. They don't have the ability or the time, the means of transportation to get to their appointments to serve community service. They don't have the ability to make their drug court meetings. And because of the trauma and the necessity that they have to relieve it, since they don't have therapy, since they can't go to a doctor and get a prescription for something else, this is the street option for them. And this is just going to cycle them through the prison process.
So what kind of a message does that send about the legislature's goals when it comes to marijuana and their idea of criminal justice?
I think a lot of it has to come down to gentrification. Okay. They don't want the poor. They don't want the bums. They don't want the street people here in Idaho. They don't want the people who mar the landscape. And that's actually the sad part, because from the perspective of a lot of them have with this as a Christian nation, the idea of compassion and being able to support the least among us, in order to help them regain themselves, regain their sense of identity, and be compassionate to the stranger, the widow, the child. Here we are looking at a situation where they're intentionally putting them in harm's way, doubling down on the punishments, doubling down on the trauma. Why is a gram of weed in a baggie a greater danger to the culture here in the state of Idaho than abuse?
And one thing I definitely want to highlight in this discussion is one of the people who testified against House Bill 7 was a local veteran with stage 4 cancer whose medical team has said that he could benefit from access to medical marijuana as he goes through his cancer treatments. Does it seem like the legislature is considering public opinion when it comes to this bill?
No, not when it comes to this bill, because I think they understand exactly who's going to be affected. Now, Jeremy Kitzhaber is an amazing veteran. He's done the work. He's put in the effort. He's worked with Alana Rubel repeatedly, trying to get a medical program here legalized in the state. And basically what it comes down to is some of his conversations with legislators amount to people like you should be able to do anything they want. Which in a scenario like this, Jeremy goes across the border, buys the stuff he needs, brings it home, uses it in his own home. Chances of him ever being encountered or having a negative encounter with the police that actually causes him to go through the court system for marijuana use in the state of Idaho is nearly nil. But it's back to who's getting hurt most, the street people. Now, during the winter session for the Idaho GOP, one of the things they came out with was their goal to ensure that recreational marijuana never happens in the state of Idaho. Now, it's interesting language because they specified recreational. So we're seeing a crack in the system that at least the GOP as a whole, Dorothy Moon, the central committees, are starting to understand the importance of at least a medical program, but being able to do right to try, right to use, being able to make sure that certain people with medical conditions have the access. But we're still in this situation where how do you create a medical program that keeps the industry out of the state of Idaho and still allows you to punish the bums on the street who are smoking at a place where the aroma is inconvenient for me and I gotta hold my nose while walking down the green belt. And I think it really comes back to that a little too often. They want to punish the people who can't afford the prescriptions for the doctors to treat the issues and the trauma that they have, that they're using it as a coping mechanism for.
Joe, I want to talk with you about a 2022 poll conducted by independent research company Survey USA that found that over 80% of Idahoans supported decriminalizing marijuana possession. And when you look at this poll versus House Bill 7, there seems to be a large disconnect between the public opinion of Idahoans and the priorities of the Idaho legislature. What has led to such a large divide?
I think a lot of it has to do with the extreme prejudice of the legislature against marijuana. Cannabis to them is a gateway drug. They see it as a way into something else. Now, when it comes to decriminalization, what an awful lot of people think of is small amounts. What are you doing busting people over a gram of flake in a baggie? Why are we paying to process them through the courts? And just take their stuff, throw it away, let them go on their way, which is actually what a lot of police officers here, particularly in Boise, do. They're not interested in the paperwork associated with a gram. They know the kid's not going to be long-term problems. They're looking for pathological users, abusers. So you see the police officers being allowed to exercise judgment. What this does from the legislative perspective is it takes away the ability of the judges to exercise judgment in sentence. So again, this comes down to we're enabling the enforcers, but we're disempowering the adjudicators.
And you're working with Kind Idaho to bring a ballot initiative about marijuana possession to a vote in 2026. What is Kind Idaho, and how does this ballot initiative aim to change our state's marijuana laws?
Now, this is interesting because from the perspective of House Bill 7, House Bill 7 is any amount, regardless. You're going to get a $300 minimum fine, just like your 100 hours of community service. Gram of flake in a baggie, $300, 100 hours community service. Kind Idaho decided this year to go with a decriminalization aspect. And this is, we don't care if you got under a gram of THC in your product or under an ounce that you're carrying on your person. We think that should be exempt from the state statutes on law. If you happen to have a couple plants in your home that you're growing for personal use, that you're cooking now and that you're using to create your own personal homemade products with, we don't care. The cops don't care. The judges don't care. The DA doesn't care. What we're saying is these people who are using small personal amounts, personal quantities, are exempt from the statutes related to drug offenses. So in order for this $300 fine and the 100 hours community service to take effect, you need to have in your possession more than 1 gram of THC in product or more than 1 ounce of marijuana or cannabis in your possession. Anything less, it's much like the police discretion. This isn't an issue. We don't care.
So this wouldn't be legalization. Kind Idaho isn't looking to legalize, just decriminalize small amounts that people have on their person or in their house.
Yeah. And this is very much an Idaho perspective on things when it comes to personal liberties, personal rights. We talk about the medical program here in the state of Idaho. Yes, there's approximately 70% support for it on the face of it. We want to see people be able to use it medicinally. But when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of the program, you start running into issues and people start asking questions. Well, if I get my medical card, what'll happen to my guns? If I get my medical card and I'm now listed as a chronic user with the Department of Health and Welfare right next to the Child Protective Services office, how does that affect my parental rights? So when people start looking at it and going, I'm not comfortable with the marijuana card program. I don't want to see people losing their children. I don't want to see people losing their Second Amendment rights. I don't want to see people exposed to violations of their Fourth Amendment or their HIPAA, even because they're using responsibly, using medicinally, but we hold all of these things over their head. And here in the state of Idaho, when you start holding things over people's heads, start going, no, I'll just drive across the border.
So you're really looking to allow people to have the opportunity to make medical choices with a medical professional, but not have, and have a small amount of possession, but not have these potential federal implications that could come with medical legalization.
Absolutely. That's one of those things. We believe in medical freedom here at Kind Idaho. We want to see the option, and decriminalization of marijuana is a step in that direction. Okay, we're able to use cannabis to open up the doors and say, okay, we see the medicinal use. Patients are able to use it. They're able to access it. They're able to use it in the state of Idaho in a right to try basis. Okay, now that we've seen that we can do successful things using cannabis medicinally, besides the CBD oils and the other things that, have come out from that, what are the other options for patients that we can open up as we go further and further down the road?
And why do you think it's been so challenging for pro-marijuana movements in Idaho to gain traction, despite what seems like pretty strong public support? Is a ballot initiative really the only viable path?
At the moment, it is, simply because of the conservative nature and the fact that we tend to vote for conservative legislators. We vote for people who disagree. It's like, well, it's been illegal for 50 years. It's obviously wrong. So that's where the bias comes in. Most of those people who are currently using it, we spend $3.5 million a week in border town dispensaries. $3.5 million. The free men and women of the state of Idaho get up, drive 60 minutes, cross the border, spend $3.5 million, get their stuff, drive back home. Cannabis is here in the state of Idaho. It's being used. It's being used responsibly because people aren't getting arrested for that $3.5 million that they spend every week in border town dispensaries. Yet here we're setting up a system where we continue to maintain this threat of a penalty that we almost never enforce, relatively speaking.
Well, and that speaks to this idea I definitely wanted to lead with, that in many aspects it feels like a modern day prohibition where is it really solving anything? Is it really doing anything? I can walk around Boise any night of the week and smell that people are using marijuana, that people are, people, like you said, are driving across the border, and they've done studies where we're spending so much money. We're paying for their schools and their teachers through the purchase of marijuana on border towns. Are these laws, are these, keeping marijuana illegal in Idaho, is it doing any good, or are we just behind the times?
We're just behind the times, because one of the things that we're doing is, in addition to the tax money for the sales in Ontario, Idaho is responsible for 10% of Oregon's legal sales. So that's money that's not being reintegrated into the Idaho communities. In addition to that, in order to enforce this new policy, we're adding more and more police to our systems, more police in Boise Police Department, more Idaho State Police. We're paying for a larger and larger police force. And these are direct taxes. These are coming out of our pockets.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. I know this is a potentially complicated issue. Lots of people have lots of feelings about it. Thank you for breaking it down, explaining House Bill 7 and what Kind Idaho is trying to do with a ballot initiative. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for your time and the invitation today, Lindsay. I appreciate it. You have an amazing week.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to leave us a review. It really does help other people find us. We'll be back tomorrow morning with our February guide. You won't want to miss it.